program. Was this a deal, or was it complete capitulation, giving in to everything that they wanted, basically allowing them to do what they want? We have on the lines with us now Dr. Andrew Bostom, and Dr. Bostom is actually associate professor of medicine at Brown University, but he is also known for his writings on Islam. He has written a book called The Legacy of Jihad in 2005, most recently in 2012. He wrote a book called Sharia versus Freedom, The Legacy of Islamic Totalitarianism. And Dr. Bostom, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Let me first ask you this, and I want to know if it's just me, but did our administration just completely backpedal on the policy and let Iran basically do whatever it wants to do while releasing funds to them and basically giving? It seemed very one-sided.
Well, when the announcement was first, the agreement announcement was first made, there was this very unlikely consensus, which I think tells you all you need to know. And who were the parties to this consensus? Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Iran's President Rouhani, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Zarif. And what did they all agree on? These people who probably never agree on much of anything, was that Iran's nuclear enrichment program would continue apace. And you could have stopped right there and said, what on earth is our administration doing? Now, there were these technical caveats put in. Well, they're only allowed to enrich, to 5%, which is more of the grade that you need for uranium for nuclear power projects. But it turns out the technology is exactly the same. And in other words, it's quite easy to just continue enriching and get to the higher levels needed for weapons-grade uranium. So in other words, nothing was done to the infrastructure itself, and it got worse. They have a plutonium heavy water reactor that's really not part of this agreement in terms of any formal dismantling. They have this weapons facility for explosives. Eventually, you have to be able to detonate such a weapon. That wasn't even on the table. And what was going on while this arrangement was being brokered in Geneva? Well, Iran had a contingent of its scientific and technical experts in Pyongyang, North Korea, discussing intercontinental ballistic missile technology. And then they've been very defiant. So the foreign minister returns to Iran, and just yesterday, he was even debating about the level of enrichment. In other words, he was saying that it's Iran that has the final say on the level of enrichment that they're allowed as part of this agreement. I mean, it just by any objective standard, it seems like a complete disaster. And the sanctions, which if you believe the sanctions were working, why lift them now? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
I thought the whole point of the sanctions was that they stopped enriching completely. And now we have given them, if I'm reading this correctly, we've opened up $800 billion that were frozen assets to Iran, to the leadership. We've allowed them to begin selling their oil, their automobiles. We've got another 1.4 billion coming out somewhere else, like in student loans or something. I couldn't even remember that. But we basically released all the money to them and said, here, you can have this, but you don't have to do anything.
Well, look, technically, their own foreign minister now, and there were some bizarre arguments that were taking place earlier in the week between Kerry and his Iranian counterpart, the foreign minister Zarif, about enrichment. I mean, it just added sort of an almost surreal quality to all that was going on. But the fact is, let's say they actually abided the agreement to stop the enrichment at 5%. It's a heroic effort that would be required. In other words, full compliance on their part with allowing inspectors in, literally, Joe, on a daily basis, and they have 19,500 centrifuges running. I mean, I don't know what sort of army of inspectors you'd need to guarantee that the level wasn't exceeding the 5% enrichment. It just doesn't even seem, plausible that could take place, and that again would assume absolute, complete, cooperation from the Iranians, which they don't exactly have the reputation for being cooperative.
So this brings up the whole question: is why? What was the thinking behind basically giving in? Because now Saudi Arabia says they may strike on their own. Israel says they may have to strike on their own. I have read things where Israel had actually visited Saudi Arabia to look at their to see if their landing areas and their facilities were good enough to launch a strike from there. I don't know if that's true, but I had read that.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about potential. At least the Saudis, the Saudis. Let's face it, the Saudis have their own agenda vis-a-vis Israel. It's not a pretty or positive one, but they have a mutual threat now. There's a big schism in Islamdom between the Sunnis and the Shiites. We see it obviously playing out in Syria, to a certain extent still in Iraq. And so, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There's a possibility at least air rights might be granted to the Israeli Air Force if it came down to that. So that's theoretically plausible.
So back to my original, what was the reason? Why all of a sudden giving in? I think look, the other unspoken in this entire discussion is the fact that what is behind Iran's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons. This is an apocalyptic, annihilationist, Jew-hating mentality that Iran gets from its belief. People may not want to understand this, but they believe in Islamic eschatology, end of times theology, both Shiites and Sunnis, that to usher in the Messianic age, the Jews need to be annihilated. And they
repeat this over and over and over. So there could be, given the nature of people like Obama and Kerry, who disregard when totalitarian ideologues say they're going to do certain things, they just disregard it. It's not in their mindset to accept that kind of mentality. That could be playing a role here. Also, let's be honest. We have to consider that both Kerry and Obama come out of a frankly anti-American mindset, at least, well into, I would say, well beyond their use. Kerry tossing his medals, Obama being under the tutelage of Pastor Wright for 20 years. I mean, those are very toxic environments. You don't want to think that that's playing into decisions like this, but we really don't know. It's such a bizarre. I mean, these were guys that were championing the sanctions, and people argued about whether the sanctions were working or not. But they Kerry and Obama seem to feel the sanctions were working. So why lift them now? Yeah,
and for nothing. When we come back, I want to get into. We are talking with Dr. Andrew Bostom. He's written a lot of books about and is an expert on Sharia law versus freedom, on Islam, the legacy of jihad, and it's Bostom. Andrew Bostom. When we come back, Dr. Bostom, I want to get into the 12th Imam. I want to get into all that because that is really pretty. I think common knowledge for our administration that the administration in Iran, the hierarchy in Iran, truly believes in this apocalyptic annihilation that has to take place in Israel for the 12th Imam to come back. We'll get into that when we come back.
Yeah, and I just think, Joe, it's very important whether they accept this or not. They're not even willing to put it on the table and discuss it, and it has to be discussed because you have to begin to understand not only why there's this relentless pursuit of the weapons, but what their aim is. Why would they want them, after all?
And we'll get into that when we come back. If you could stay tuned, Dr. Andrew Bostom, we'll be back with him. Bostom. Dr. Bostom, before we continue, I think if people want to go and see your works and you have a blog and you have all that, but if we run out of time because we're only going to go to the bottom of the hour, I wanted to get that in now. How can people find you?
The simplest way to where everything's pooled together is just to go to my Twitter account, which is @Andrew Bostom, just my name in lowercase, and then they can link from that to the website and to my books and writings. There's one additional little monograph that just came out, which is actually a good introduction to some of these subjects we're talking about right now. It's called "The Mufti's Islamic Jew Hatred: What the Nazis Learned from the Muslim Pope." It's about Haj Amin al-Husani and his ideology, and he's a very critical figure in terms of understanding the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and really the nature of Israel's conflict with the global Muslim world. That's available as an ebook that just came out at Amazon, and it's also available in print.
So that would be at Andrew Bostom, Bostom, and that's your Twitter account, and that'll link everything.
Right.
Terrific. Now let's get into. I've heard about this, and they're very upfront about this, about Iran and the 12th Imam, and what has to happen for the 12th Imam to come back.
Yeah, the way the best summary statement I've seen that describes this is just a couple of sentences. It comes from a leader of one of these martyr brigades, closely associated with Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, and he says the Jew is the most obstinate enemy, and he's quoting now Quran 582, so the 5th surah or chapter of the Quran, the 82nd verse. He says, the Jew is the most obstinate enemy of the devout. The main war will determine the destiny of mankind. The reappearance of the 12th Imam will lead to a war between Israel and the Shia. And so he's invoking this very succinctly, this end of times belief. And what is he talking about? Well, allegedly, there's this terrible schism between Sunni and Shiite Islam. Many of the original Shiite leaders are slaughtered or poisoned over time, and one of these leaders survives, disappears, and allegedly communicates to the world through various agents, the last of whom died in 941 CE. And so what's supposed to happen upon his reappearance is the ultimate triumph of Shiite Islam in terms of reestablishing a Shiite caliphate. The last Shiite caliph for all of Islam was Ali, and the Shia are the partisans of Ali. But tied to his reappearance, and he's a named figure in Shiite Islam. He's a more vague figure. The Mahdi is also a figure in Sunni Islam. But what draws them together, unfortunately, is that to usher in this messianic age, which will be very bloody. It starts off in both Sunni and Shiite Islam with the Jews being annihilated. Now, the Jews are identified with the Muslim equivalent of the Antichrist, so they're quite evil. And the Muslim Antichrist is considered to be Jewish in some traditions, but always accompanied by Jews. And so these Mahdi-like figures are supposed to precipitate the slaughter of the Jews to usher in this messianic period, which of course will be very bloody, but will ultimately lead to the triumph of Islam over all other religions.
All right, now let me stop you there and try and interpret this for our. Why is it important then for Iran to get a hold of, to develop a nuclear weapon?
Well, the composite Jewish identity these days at our time is the state of Israel. It's called the Jewish state, and so that is the ingathering of the Jews. In fact, going back 100 years, the ingathering of the Jews and the Zionist movement triggered all these end of times beliefs amongst both the Sunni and the Shiites. This pamphlet that I mentioned that I've just produced includes the Mufti's Islamic Jew Hatred, includes a fatwa written in 1937 by the leader who became the leader of the Palestinian Muslim movement, where he ends this fatwa calling for a global jihad to annihilate Palestinian Jewry. This is before there was a state of Israel, after all. It's 1937. He ends this proclamation or fatwa with one of these canonical traditions that calls for the annihilation of Jews to usher in the Messianic time. So we saw this the Zionist movement was such an affront to the global Muslim community. After all, Jews were supposed to stay subjugated under Islamic law. That for a development like this, it must mean that there was something apocalyptic brewing. And so we've seen these themes really revitalized in the last century, and Iran is the epitome of this. I mean, they are very open with their rhetoric. It's also in the Hamas charter.
And that's why Israel is so concerned, because if they get a nuclear weapon, because of this idea and this apocalyptic belief, they will use the nuclear weapon to usher in the 12th Imam and this whole end of times thing.
And there's another aspect to this which also goes unspoken. Because of the Islamic conception, both Shiite and Sunni again, of martyrdom, there have been numerous statements from leaders like Khomeini and even the so-called more moderate Rafsanjani that essentially say Iran is willing to take a nuclear strike from Israel, retaliatory, preemptive, whatever it is, because the belief is that first of all, they can withstand it. They're a much larger country than Israel, and that it's an act of martyrdom. That the destruction of Israel is more important than the damage, equal or even greater, that might accrue to Iran, and that Islam will still triumph on the basis of its willingness to expose itself to mass martyrdom.
So we have only about a minute left, and I just.
So deterrent, in other words, basically, Joe, it's not like mutual assured destruction in the Soviet era, et cetera.
Right.
There may not be a real deterrence.
Yes, and the only way of doing it, we basically kind of turned our back on them by doing this.
Yeah, we're in denial. It's a psychological, denial. As a physician, I see this all the time with patients who have terminal illnesses, and that's completely appropriate. But in this case, you're dealing with an existential threat to an entire community. And Iran looks at us as the great Satan. Israel's just a stepping stone. Israel is the little Satan. That's why they're developing ICBMs. They don't need ICBMs to reach Israel. ICBMs are not for Israel. They're for other targets, including potentially the United States.
That's going to be very interesting. And Dr. Bostom, I thank you for spending time with us. Dr. Andrew Bostom, you could go to his Twitter account. It's at Andrew Bostom, Bostom, and you get a connection to all of his writings and everything. And thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Take care.
Bye-bye.